But a single flash of old brass was about to burn the billionaire's empire to the ground.
Stop! That crest! It's impossible! Where did you get that button?
A harbor rat like you doesn't belong in a college lecture hall. Stay in the slime.
The brutal stomp of a $12,000 crocodile leather boot down on the freezing stones. It almost crushed the hands clawing at the wet gravel, a soaked scholarship portfolio. Crisp, white pages representing years of high school dedication, instantly drinking the oily harbor slush and turning to gray ash. But the arrogant tycoon had no idea. The rugged man with eyes as sharp as blades, the father taking the blow to his spine to shield his 19-year-old son, was a mountain he could never hope to climb. And from the torn vadau of the young man's old jacket, a sudden flash of light cut through the storm. It struck the 3-inch tinted window of a luxury Maybach parked 30 yards away, a single custom-made brass button engraved with an ancient ship crest, the exact piece a supreme female billionaire, now pushing her car door open, had sworn to turn the entire ocean upside down to find. For 8 long years, she saw it through the window of her Maybach. That was how Evelyn Harrison saw most of the world these days, through 3 inches of soundproof, tinted glass, moving at 40 miles an hour. Her, the city wasn't a place anymore. It was just a series of frames passing by before she could ever really touch it. It was exactly 7:42 a.m. The acquisition report for the Old Wharf District was open on her tablet. Her CFO had messaged her at dawn. She had already read it twice. Now she was reading it a third time, because the third time was always when people's lies started to surface. Evelyn didn't like lies. She dealt in hard, cold facts. "Marcus," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried that heavy, executive weight. "The traffic on the bridge is backing up." "I see it, ma'am," the driver replied. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He had been driving her for 12 years. He understood the rhythm of her anxiety. Taking the lower harbor route, it's messy, but it's faster. Messy was an understatement. The limousine turned sharply. It left the clean, sterile concrete of the highway. It rolled down into the belly of Pier 43, the old commercial docks. This wasn't the New York of glass skyscrapers and $5 lattes. This was the New York of fish guts, diesel exhaust, and harbor fog. That heavy, bitter mist that clings to your clothes. The kind that eats away at iron. Evelyn didn't look up from her screen. She didn't want to. This place had a smell. Even through the heavy leather seals of the luxury car, she could taste the brine. It tasted like salt. It tasted like tears. It tasted exactly like the night 8 years ago. The night the Coast Guard called her at 3 a.m. to tell her that Daniel's luxury yacht had vanished off the radar during a Category 3 storm. 8 years. People told her to move on. They said grief has a shelf life. They were wrong. Grief doesn't disappear. It just changes shape. It becomes a ghost. It sits in the passenger seat, staring at you in the dark. Daniel was gone. The ocean had swallowed him whole. No body, no closure, just an empty estate and a mountain of money that felt more like a cage every single day. Suddenly, the car jerked. The brakes groaned. Marcus cursed under his breath. A rare slip of his professional mask. "Apologies, Mrs. Harrison." Some truck blocked the narrow lane. "There's a commotion up ahead." Evelyn sighed. She closed her eyes for a brief second. Her head throbbed. She looked out the window expecting to see the usual harbor grittiness. Truck drivers arguing over parking spaces. Shouting normal, ugly, everyday life. But then, the harbor fog shifted. The mist rolled back just an inch. It saw 2 men stood on the wet, slippery cobblestones, surrounded by the crushing boots of the harbor managers. One was a young man, a 19-year-old kid, holding a soaked folder to his chest like it was gold. The other was an older man, rugged, broad-shouldered. He had the distinct, tacked, heavy-jawed look of someone, but it wasn't the commotion that caught her attention. It wasn't the shouting. It was a flash of light. A sharp, sudden glint of brass cut through the gray morning fog. It struck the window of her Maybach 30 yards away. It wasn't the spark of a cheap piece of glass. It wasn't glitza. It wasn't the glitz of a diamond. It was a dull, heavy reflection. The kind only old, solid metal can make when the sun hits it at just the right angle. Evelyn stopped breathing. Her hand froze over the tablet. but her mind didn't. Pulse began to race. A violent hammering in her chest. That shape, that specific ancient silhouette of a classic ship crest. She knew that crest. She had paid an artisan in London to hand-carve the mold for it. "Marcus," she whispered. The executive register was entirely gone. Her voice belonged to a mother who had been screaming into the ocean for nearly a decade. "Stop the car, right now." The brutal stomp of a $12,000 crocodile leather boot crashed down on the freezing stones. It missed Leo's fingers by a mere inch. But the intent was there, the malice was real. Thomas Sterling stood over the boy like a conqueror, his face flushed red with an unholy rage. He pointed a trembling, furious index finger at his custom shoes. They were now splattered with oily harbor slush and silver fish scales. "You blind piece of garbage," Sterling roared. His voice bounced off the corrugated iron walls of the warehouse. "Look at this. Do you have any idea what these cost? You couldn't buy a single lace if you worked this dock for the rest of your pathetic life." Standing directly in front of him, trying to shield his son, was Raymond, a big man, broad-shouldered and rugged. He wore a faded, oversized oilskin jacket that had seen. His hands were bare, raw, red, and cracked from the freezing salt water. He held a grease-stained rag, his body half bent, in a defensive posture. He was trying to absorb the venom so none of it would hit Leo. Leo was 19 now. A bright, sharp young man with eyes full of future that didn't belong in this dirt. But right now his face was pale. He was on his knees, his hands trembling as he pressed a thick leather portfolio tightly against his chest. It was his university scholarship application for NYU. The interview was at 9:30 a.m. He had worked the grueling night shift at the fish market with his dad just to afford the train fare to get there. "It was an accident, sir," Leo whispered. His voice shook, but he tried to lock it down. He didn't want his father to see him break. "The ice crate caught on the hook. I didn't mean to splash you." "An accident?" Sterling sneered. He looked down at Leo's cheap, oversized thrift store blazer. "Look at you. You dress like an elegant beggar. What is that folder? A scholarship? A piece of trash like you doesn't belong in a university lecture hall. You belong right here, guts deep in fishes like your old man." With a sudden, brutal swipe of his arm, Sterling knocked the portfolio out of Leo's grip. The heavy folder hit the greasy puddle, the crisp white pages inside, containing years of Leo's academic achievements, essays, and dreams, instantly drank the dirty, oil-slicked harbor water. They turned gray, ruined in a second. Leo gasped, dropping his head, his fingers at the freezing gravel to save what was left. Sterling raised his heavy boot again. He was going to stomp directly onto the boy's hands, to crush the fingers that wrote those essays. With a heavy, silent grunt, Raymond threw his massive frame forward. He covered his 19-year-old son entirely. Sterling's heavy leather boot slammed hard into Raymond's spine, a dull, sickening thud. Raymond didn't yell, he didn't cry out. He just dug his bare fingers into the stones, locking his muscles, turning his body into an unbreakable shield. Leo was safe beneath him. Raymond's jaw clenched so hard the muscles along his quai ham squared tightly. His eyes, dark and sharp as shattered obsidian, locked onto the ground. He had the training somewhere deep in his blood to take this man apart in 3 seconds. He could feel the phantom instinct rising in his fists. But he didn't move, he suppressed it, because he knew the rules of the world. If a dock worker strikes a billionaire, the system wins. The father goes to jail. The son's future is murdered forever. For Leo's clean soul, Raymond took the blow. He chose the weight of the boot over the ruin of his son. "Look at you," Sterling scoffed, stepping back, completely indifferent to the pages floating away in the slush. "Harbor rat rack re, both of you." The tension was suffocating. The other dock workers stood frozen, their breath forming white plumes in the freezing mist. Nobody dared to speak. As Raymond slowly helped Leo up, the vat-ow of the boy's torn blazer shifted under the pale morning light. The cheap thread had split completely from the scuffle, and there, revealed against the wet, dark fabric, was the single piece of old metal, the heavy brass button, the engraved ship crest. It caught a stray beam of sun through the harbor fog. It flashed, a brilliant, ancient spark of gold, and that was when the shadow of the supreme female billionaire fell across the stones. The mist over the harbor parted for just a single heartbeat. The freezing wind swept across Pier 43, carrying away the heavy suffocating scent of diesel exhaust. It was a brief gap in the gray morning sky. A stray beam of pale November sunlight cut straight through the fog. It didn't hit the luxury car. It didn't warm Thomas Sterling's expensive coat. It fell directly on Leo's chest. The scuffle had left the young man's old blazer torn open at the seam. The cheap thread had split completely under the strain, and there, revealed against the wet, dark fabric where the ordinary buttons had fallen away, was the single piece of old metal. The brass button. It caught the sunlight and flared, a brilliant ancient spark of gold cutting through the mud. It didn't just reflect the morning ray, it seemed to capture it. The metal was dull in places, scratched by years of hard labor, but the engraving was unmistakable. The crisp, clean silhouette of a classic ship crest, the sharp, intentional flaw in the left sail, a microscopic line where the mold had slipped. Evelyn Harrison stopped breathing. Inside the soundproof cabin of the Maybach, the world went entirely cold. Her tablet slipped from her fingers. It hit the leather seat with a soft, unnoticed thud. Her eyes locked onto that flash of gold through the tinted glass. Her mind refused to process it. It was impossible. It was a statistical zero. She had paid an artisan in London to hand-carve that exact mold 8 years ago. She had watched the smith smash the master cast with a hammer so a duplicate could never exist. It gives it character, Evelyn. Her husband's voice echoed from a dark room in her memory. Her heart began to slam against her ribs. A violent, terrifying rhythm. Her fingers found the chrome handle of the car door. She didn't think. She didn't calculate the corporate risk or the public image. The executive mask she had worn for 40 years simply shattered on the floor of the car. The door clicked open. The seal broke. Evelyn stepped out into the raw, unfiltered stench of the fish market. The icy wind hit her face, blowing her silver hair across her eyes, but she didn't stop. Her expensive leather heels crunched hard against the greasy gravel. She walked straight past Thomas Sterling. Her security detail scrambled to form a protective wall around her, their heavy coats rustling. But she pushed through them with a sharp, frantic wave of her hand. Sterling turned around, his arrogant smirk instantly morphing into a professional smile. He smoothed his cashmere coat, stepping forward to greet the woman who held his contracts. "Mrs. Harrison, I am so glad you're here. These harbor rats have no respect for." Evelyn didn't look at him. She didn't even register his voice. She walked right past his outstretched hand. Raymond was still on his knees, his massive, broad-shouldered frame trembling slightly as he pulled Leo up from the wet stones. He was wiping the dirty slush from his 19-year-old son's face, his calloused hands surprisingly gentle. Evelyn stopped at the edge of the puddle. Her knees gave out. She dropped to the wet cobblestones. She didn't care about the midnight blue designer coat soaking in the oily water. She knelt right there in the dirt, her body shaking as she leaned closer to Leo's chest. Her hand reached out, her index finger hovering just millimeters away from the scratched brass. "Let me see," she whispered. Her voice was broken, stripped of all power. "Please, let me see it." Raymond did not move. He stayed frozen on the wet stones, a wall of scarred oilskin jacket shielding his 19-year-old son. His eyes were wide, alert, and tracking every single shift in Evelyn's face. He had seen all kinds of people in his 8 years of drifting through the city's underbelly. He knew the angry ones. He knew the indifferent ones. But he did not know this. He could not understand the raw, shattering grief staring back at him from a woman who looked like she owned the entire world. "Please," Evelyn said again. Her voice was even smaller now, stripped of everything. No authority, no power, just a mother kneeling in the dirt. "The button on his coat, I need to know. Where did you find it?" Raymond looked down at Leo's chest. His hand, red, raw, and stiff from the freezing salt water, slowly moved over the torn fabric of the blazer. He covered the brass piece with his thumb, deeply defensive. He didn't want this rich stranger taking the only beautiful thing his son owned. "I don't know," Raymond rasped. His voice was deep, scraping the bottom of his throat. It sounded like gravel being dragged across cold concrete. "It was just there, in the coat." "Where?" Evelyn pressed, leaning closer. She did not care about the smell of fish anymore. She did not care about the diesel exhaust or the oily water ruining her clothes. She only cared about the breath leaving this man's lungs. "Where did it come from, Raymond?" "The hospital," he said. He spoke slowly, carefully, like a man who had to construct every single sentence from scratch because his mind did not keep the blueprints anymore. 8 years ago, in Montauk, I woke up in a white room. My head was heavily bandaged, broken ribs, no wallet, no name, just empty space in my head. Raymond's eyes drifted toward the gray harbor water, lost in the fog of his own mind. They looked for my family. Nobody came. The nurses, they were kind. But they needed the bed. They gave me some clothes from the Nonchen bin. This oilskin jacket was one of them. It was missing 3 buttons on the front. I found this brass piece later. It was loose in the inner pocket, deep down in the lining. It must have fallen off the original owner's shirt before they threw the jacket away. I didn't know what it meant. I just liked the weight of it. When Leo turned 11, when he needed a real coat to walk to school in the winter, I gave him my jacket. I sewed that button on his coat myself, to keep the wind out. Evelyn listened. She did not blink. Every single word was a hammer blow straight to her chest. It matched perfectly. The hospital. Montauk. 8 years ago. Her hand trembled as she reached out, stopping just short of touching his rugged jawline. "Look at me," she whispered, her tears freezing on her cheeks. "Please, look at my face. Do you know who I am? Do you remember anything?" Raymond looked at her, really looked at her. He studied the sharp silver hair, the elegant line of her brow, the deep, agonizing hope in her dark eyes. He searched the cold, empty rooms of his memory. He wanted to find something. For her sake, he desperately wanted a spark. A name, a flash of a warm nothing. Just gray harbor fog, just absence. "No," Raymond said quietly. There was no lie in his voice, no calculation, just the simple, devastating honesty of a man who owned nothing but his own emptiness. "I'm sorry, lady, I don't know you. Your name," Evelyn choked out. "What do they call you?" "Raymond," he said, pulling Leo a little tighter against the freezing wind. "The shelter staff gave it to me. Raymond Vance. It's on my card. But it's not mine, not really. It's just what I go by." "And the young man?" Evelyn turned her eyes to Leo. "Leo," Raymond said. A proud, fierce light broke through the grimace on his face, the only real warmth in his features. "He's my son. He's 19 now. He's the only reason I didn't walk into that river 8 years ago. He's everything I have." Evelyn looked from the rugged man to the youth. Leo had stepped forward now, standing shoulder to shoulder with his father, his chest squared despite the torn blazer and the ruined NYU portfolio in his hand. He had Daniel's eyes, strong, unyielding. She stood up slowly, her knees cracking from the cold stones. The wind from the harbor blew her silver hair across her face, but her posture returned. The spine of the Harrison Empire straightened, but the warmth remained. She looked at her security chief, who was waiting for her command. "Cancel the meeting with Sterling," she said, her voice dropping back into that low, unbreakable executive register. "Get the car ready. We are taking them with us." The Maybach did not head toward the sprawling Harrison estate. Evelyn knew better than that. A black luxury limousine pulling up to a billionaire's mansion with a bruised harbor worker, and a shattered young man would immediately set off the security alarms. The doorman would whisper. The house staff would gossip. And right now, the world did not need to know they existed. Instead, Marcus drove them straight to Midtown, to a quiet, high-end boutique hotel tucked away on a forgotten side street where the ultra-wealthy went when they wanted to vanish. Harrison Holdings kept a corporate penthouse suite on the very top floor. It had a private, biometric elevator, no check-in desk, no paper logbooks, just a dynamic security code and total absolute anonymity. The elevator ride was entirely silent. Raymond stood in the far corner, his massive frame casting a long, imposing shadow over the polished brass walls. He looked far too big for the small space, but his broad shoulders were hunched forward, defensive. He kept one scarred arm tucked slightly ahead of Leo, tracking the floor numbers as they lit up. 28, 29, 30. He looked exactly like a combat soldier waiting for a lethal trap to spring. The doors slid open without a sound. The penthouse suite was vast, warm. It smelled of expensive cedarwood, fresh espresso, and clean linen. It was an entirely different universe from the salt, diesel exhaust, and fish guts of Pier 43. Raymond did not step onto the plush cream rug immediately. He stopped dead at the threshold. He looked down at his heavy, mud-caked boots. Then he looked at Evelyn with a silent, proud reluctance. "It's okay," Evelyn said softly. She stepped onto the rug herself, completely indifferent to the trail of wet harbor grime ruining her own designer clothes. "Come inside, Raymond, please. Both of you." She called her personal housekeeper, a trusted woman who had been with her for 2 decades, and gave brief first instructions. 10 minutes later, a hot bath was drawn. Clean clothes left on the marble counter, simple things. Dark jeans, a heavy gray wool sweater, shoes that Evelyn had guessed the size of just by looking at Raymond's broad, solid frame. She had spent a lifetime measuring people for corporate survival. She was rarely wrong. While Raymond and Leo were cleaning up, Evelyn stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the freezing November drizzle blur the bright lights of Manhattan. The city looked incredibly small from up here, indifferent to the human pain below. She picked up her phone and made one urgent call to Dr. Patricia Hale, a renowned neurologist who specialized in trauma-induced amnesia for federal law enforcement. "I need you at the Midtown suite," Evelyn said, her voice dropping into that low, unbreakable register. "Bring your baseline equipment. Do not log the visit." An hour later, the bedroom door opened. Raymond stepped out. The thick, wild beard was trimmed tight to his jawline. The matted hair was washed and cut back from his forehead. And when the warm light from the crystal chandelier hit his face, Evelyn's breath caught completely in her throat. Without the grime, without the wild hair, the bone structure was a devastating ghost. The high, sharp cheekbones, the specific heavy slope of the Quai-Ham-squared jawline. It was not Daniel's face. Daniel had been softer, taking after her side. This man possessed the rugged, sharp architecture of Thomas Harrison, her late husband, dead for 23 years. Leo followed right behind his father, clean-shaven, wearing a simple white shirt that fit his lean, athletic frame. He looked like a young man poised on the edge of greatness, but his eyes were fixed on the floor. Raymond looked down at his own new clothes, shifting uncomfortably. Leo's portfolio was completely ruined, Raymond said, his voice still carrying that rough gravel texture from years of cold docks. He looked at the window, his chest tight. 8 years of work, his essays, his grades, it's all gone in that oily puddle. He has an interview in an hour at NYU. He won't go now. He thinks his future is murdered. Evelyn felt a sharp ache in her chest, a physical, maternal pain. "Nothing is over, Raymond," she whispered, looking at her grandson. "I promise you both, the Harrisons do not let wolves dictate their future." Dr. Hale arrived 20 minutes later, ready to pierce the fog. The mahogany table was vast, separating them like a dark wooden river. Raymond sat with his large hands flat on the polished surface. They were clean now, but the scars remained white, jagged lines across his knuckles, left by cargo crates and sharp oyster shells. Dr. Hale leaned forward, her notepad remaining closed. She was not writing. She was just looking at his eyes, watching the pupils dilute as the quiet room fell under the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock. "The White Room," Raymond began, his voice dropping into that low, gravelly register. He stared at the center of the table, his eyes tracking a pattern in the wood grain that only he could see. It was cold, not the room itself, but my bones. The cold was inside my chest, like I had swallowed a block of ice and it wouldn't melt. Every time I try to look back before that room, it's like looking into a rearview mirror in a heavy storm, just blurry shapes, bad smells. But lately, since I gave Leo that brass piece, things are shifting in the dark. "What kind of things, Raymond?" Dr. Hale asked softly. Her voice was steady, anchoring him to the present so he wouldn't drift too far into the dark water. "Water," he said. The word came out short, sharp. "A lot of water, but it's not the harbor. It's bigger, darker. The waves aren't hitting a wooden dock. They're hitting fiberglass, splintering it. I can hear the sound of a hull cracking under massive pressure, like a bone breaking but magnified 1,000 times. There was a siren, a loud mechanical wail, red lights flashing against gray harbor fog. Everything was tilted. The floor was moving violently beneath my feet, throwing me against a wall. I was holding on to something metal, a railing. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turned white. The memory was not just an image anymore. It was a fizzle living the trauma. "You weren't alone on that deck," Dr. Hale stated, her tone flat, factual, devoid of pressure. "No," Raymond rasped, his eyes snapping wide open, staring at nothingness. "There was a young man. He looked like me, but smaller, rich clothes. He was bleeding heavily from his forehead. The red water was running down into his eyes. But he wasn't crying. He was screaming at me over the roar of the gale. He called me a name. Not Raymond. It started with an A. Arthur. Yes, he was yelling my real name. He was pushing me. He had his hands flat on my chest, shoving me toward the edge of the open deck. He had a life vest, the only one left. He didn't put it on himself. He threw it over my head. He was buckling the heavy straps, his hands shaking, but he kept saying, "You have to go, Arthur. You have to live. Take care of Leo. He's 11 now. He needs a father. They can't know you're alive. Richard did this." Raymond's hand moved to his own throat, his fingers brushing against his collarbone, remembering the phantom weight of a vest. Evelyn sat perfectly still across the table, her fingers interlocking so tightly, her nails dug into her skin. Her breath was shallow, dying, and then the boat broke. Raymond whispered, the words spilling out fast, tumbling over each other. Of came from the dark. It's massive like a wall of black concrete. It tore him away from the steel railing. I reached out. I tried to grab his shirt. My fingers brushed against his chest, right against his buttons, and then I fell backward into the freezing dark water. He fell completely silent. The ticking of the clock returned, louder now. "The button," Evelyn breathed, her voice barely a ghost of a sound in the vast room. "When you fell, your hand caught his clothes." "I think so," Raymond said, looking down at his palm, opening and closing it as if expecting to find the brass piece still trapped inside his flesh. "When I woke up in that hospital, my fingers were locked tightly into a fist. They had to use tools to pry them open. I thought it was just a muscle cramp from the sea. But it was the button. I had torn it right off his shirt before the ocean took him. The rain outside the penthouse had turned into a steady, freezing drizzle. It blurred the bright lights of Manhattan into long, bleeding streaks against the cold glass. Inside, the warmth of the room felt incredibly fragile, temporary. James Whitfield, Evelyn's personal attorney, and a man who had spent 30 years looking at the worst parts of human nature through manila folders, stepped out of the private elevator. He did not look at Raymond. He did not look at Leo, who was sitting quietly in the corner, staring blankly at his own hands. He walked straight to Evelyn and laid a single sheet of paper onto the large mahogany table. The paper was from the genomic testing facility at Columbia University. It did not have names. It only had markers, percentages, the cold, unfeeling architecture of human biology. Evelyn did not pick up the paper. She could not bring herself to touch it. Her fingers stayed locked together on the table. "Tell me, James," she whispered. Her voice was cracked, barely holding on to its foundation. "Just say it out loud." "He is not Daniel," Whitfield said simply. Evelyn closed her eyes. A part of her, the desperate, irrational part of a mother that had kept her staring out of car windows for 8 long years, withered and died in that exact second. "I knew it," she breathed. "I saw his face. I knew it wasn't him." "But he is not a stranger either, Evelyn," Whitfield continued. His eyes shifted toward Raymond, who sat perfectly still, watching them with the calm, guarded patience of a man used to being discussed by people in power. "The DNA shows a 99-8 paternal match to Thomas Harrison." The room dropped into a freezing silence. The only sound was the low-and-toos snapped wide open. Evelyn's eyes snapped wide. "Lawyer. Thomas? That's impossible. Thomas has been dead for 23 years. "It is not impossible," Whitfield said, pulling a second, older folder from his leather briefcase. 32 years ago, Thomas had an undocumented relationship with a woman named Elena Santos. She worked in the maintenance division of Harrison Holdings. The relationship produced a son. His birth certificate listed the father as unknown. But Thomas set up a blind offshore trust that funneled monthly payments to Elena until the day he died. "Your real name isn't Raymond Vance, sir. Your name is Arthur Santos. You are Daniel's younger half-brother, the son Thomas hid from the world." Raymond, Arthur, did not gasp. He did not flinch. He just absorbed the cold math of the paper, his large brow furrowing slightly as the pieces of his broken memory began to smash into reality. Arthur, the name that started with an A, the name Daniel had screamed over the roar of the ocean. "But that's not the end of it," Whitfield said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming dangerous. "We ran the young man's DNA too, Leo." Evelyn leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table so hard her nails turned white. "And Leo is not Arthur's son," Evelyn's eyes. "Leo is Daniel's son, his only child, born to a young woman named Maria Santos, Elena's daughter, just months before the yacht sank. Daniel found out about his brother. He found out about the child. He went to Montauk that night 8 years ago to bring them both into the family, to give them the Harrison name, and Richard Harrison knew it. He knew if Arthur and Leo were recognized, his own 30-year plan to inherit the Harrison fortune would be shredded. He didn't just want Daniel gone, Evelyn. He wanted the entire bloodline erased. Evelyn stood up slowly. The grief was gone. In its place was something older, cold, and entirely lethal. She looked at Arthur, the brother who had taken the blows. She looked at Leo, the 19-year-old grandson whose portfolio had been tossed into a puddle. "James," she said, her voice dropping into a dark, quiet valley, "call the board. Tell them we are holding an emergency meeting tomorrow morning. And tell Richard I will be there personally." The boardroom on the 38th floor of Harrison Holdings was a cathedral of glass and polished marble, floating high above the gray shroud of Manhattan. It was Thursday, exactly 9:02 a.m. The extraordinary shareholder summit was underway. The room smelled of expensive espresso, heavy cologne, and the invisible, intoxicating scent of absolute power. Richard Harrison sat at the center of the crescent-shaped mahogany table, slowly adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke Brioni suit. He smiled, a smooth, practiced flex of his facial muscles. He had spent the last 6 weeks gathering proxies, shaking hands and securing votes. Today was a mere formality. The agenda was simple: a structural amendment to the corporate governance framework that would grant him unilateral control over the Harrison Family Trust. Permanent, unchallengeable. He had planned this day for 3 years, managing the absence of his cousin Daniel like a perfectly balanced asset on a ledger. "If everyone could take their seats," Richard said, his voice smooth, echoing with the effortless authority of a man who believed he had finally outpaced his past. "We have a quorum. I'd like to call this extraordinary session to order." He picked up a gold Mont Blanc pen, preparing to sign the opening resolution. Then the heavy oak doors at the back of the boardroom clicked. The seal broke. It didn't swing open with dramatic violence. It opened slowly, with a heavy, deliberate weight that made every billionaire and board member in the room turn their heads in absolute shock. Evelyn Harrison walked in. She wore a charcoal wool coat, her silver hair cut like a razor, her posture so rigid it seemed to command the very air in the room to freeze. Beside her was James Whitfield, his leather briefcase tucked under his arm like a weapon. Behind them came Carla Voss, the retired homicide detective, her eyes scanning the room with absolute stillness. But it wasn't the lawyers or the detectives that made Richard's hand freeze over the gold pen. It was the men following them. Arthur walked into the room. He wore a dark navy suit, tailored perfectly to his massive, broad-shouldered frame. His beard was trimmed tight to his jawline, his scarred forehead fully visible under the harsh fluorescent lights. He didn't look at the billionaires. He didn't look at the expensive artwork on the walls. He walked with the unhurried, terrifying steadiness of a man who had spent 8 years sleeping on concrete and had therefore forgotten how to be intimidated by a room. Beside him, matching his stride, was 19-year-old Leo. The young man was wearing a neat white shirt, and on the lapel of his blazer, pinned securely with a fresh silver backing, was the single, heavy brass button, the ship crest. Richard's face drained of color. The smooth tan complexion of a man who frequented Hampton resorts turned a sickly, translucent gray. His eyes dived from Arthur's jawline, the unmistakable, rugged bone structure of Thomas Harrison, to the brass button gleaming under the boardroom light. "Evelyn," Richard stammered, his voice cracking, the corporate mask fracturing in a second. This is an internal board meeting. Unauthorized personnel cannot." "Sit down, Richard," Evelyn said. Her voice wasn't loud. It was low, cold. It carried the chilling weight of an iron door slamming shut in a tomb. She didn't go to her usual seat. She walked straight to the head of the table, slinging her coat over the back of the chair, and stood sung-sunging, looking down at the man who had managed her grief like a resource. James Whitfield stepped forward, opening his briefcase without a sound. He didn't offer a dramatic speech. He built the case like an architect, foundation first. He laid out the birth records from 32 years ago. The genetic database results from Columbia University showing Arthur's undeniable paternal match to Thomas Harrison. Then came the medical files from the Montauk emergency room, dated exactly 48 hours after Daniel's yacht went down. 8 years ago, Whitfield's voice boomed through the pristine acoustic room, clear and unyielding. Daniel Harrison discovered he had a younger brother, Arthur. He discovered Arthur was raising his son, Leo. Daniel went to Montauk that night to bring his family home, but the boat was sabotaged. The fuel line had been plugged and severed from the inside before it left the marina. A collective gasp rippled through the board members. Several elderly directors leaned forward, their faces pale. "We have the sworn statement of Phyllis Barron, the head nurse," Whitfield continued, dropping another file onto the table, "who identifies Richard Harrison as the man who arrived at the hospital hours after the accident, asking if the unidentified John Doe was dead. We have the personal laptop logs of Linda Park, Richard's former executive assistant, documenting the systematic erasure of the Maritime Police referral reports." "This is a fabrication," Richard shouted, slamming his hands on the table, his eyes wide with the frantic terror of a trapped animal. "You're bringing a dock worker and a bastard student into this room to steal my life's work. The DNA means nothing. This proves nothing about the boat." "It proves motive, Richard." Carla Voss spoke for the first time, her voice dry, clinical. "You intercepted the letter Thomas left for Daniel. You knew that if Arthur's existence became public, the inheritance trust would split. Your 30-year plan to inherit Harrison Holdings would vanish. You didn't just want Daniel gone. You needed the bloodline erased." Evelyn leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the mahogany table. She looked at Richard. She had known him since he was a child. She had given him his first job. She had trusted him when her heart was broken. "Daniel didn't die for the money, Richard," Evelyn said, her voice trembling with a ferocious, quiet rage. "He died because he was trying to save his brother. He gave Arthur his life vest. He pushed him off that sinking deck so this young man could have a future." She reached out, gently placing her hand on Leo's shoulder, her thumb brushing against the brass button. "The board will vote now," Evelyn said, her eyes locked onto Richard's sweating face, "on the immediate suspension of Richard Harrison's executive authority, pending the outcome of the federal indictment that was signed 60 minutes ago." The vote took less than 10 seconds, 11-2. Richard sat frozen as the security guards, his own security guards wearing the Harrison crest on their blazers, stepped into the room and placed their hands on his shoulders. He didn't look at them. He just looked at the table, at the gold pen rolling slowly across the polished wood, and at the man named Arthur who had survived the ocean just to stand in his way. The 38th floor emptied quickly. In the brutal world of high finance, power does not leave a vacuum. It leaves an infection that everyone flees. The lawyers, the board members, the stenographers, they all vanished down the glass elevators, whispering frantically into their phones. Richard was gone too, escorted out through the service exit by federal marshals, his hands cuffed tightly in front of his $12,000 suit. He had spent his entire life trying to climb a mountain made of paper wealth, only to realize the foundation was sand. Evelyn Harrison remained at the head of the table. She looked smaller now that the battle was finally over. The rigidness in her shoulders relaxed, just a fraction, letting the exhaustion of an 8-year-old weight finally show on her face. She looked down at her hands, then up at the large glass window overlooking the East River. Arthur stood by the glass. He hadn't sat down during the entire 3-hour meeting. He didn't know how to sit in leather chairs that cost more than his old monthly shelter stipend. He was looking out at the rolling water, his large, calloused hand resting gently on Leo's shoulder. Leo was holding a new, clean leather folder that James Whitfield had prepared, a full scholarship package to New York University, backed entirely by the Harrison Foundation. The grueling interview was no longer necessary. His academic merit had been documented, his right to a future restored. "The legal team will need about 6 months to clean up the corporate wreckage," Evelyn said. Her voice was quiet, lacking the executive edge she had just used to crush Richard. It was just a mother speaking to her family. "The trust will be restructured. The inheritance, everything Daniel owned, everything Thomas left. It belongs to you and Leo. You can take your place at the head of this table, Arthur. You own this empire now." Arthur didn't turn around immediately. He watched a solitary tugboat push a massive barge through the gray, chopping waves far below. I don't need the building, Evelyn, Arthur said softly. His voice was low, deep, still carrying that rough gravel texture from years of cold docks. I don't know how to run a shipping empire. I know how to carry cargo boxes. I know how to look a young man in the eye and teach him how to be entirely honest. He turned around slowly. The navy suit fit him perfectly, highlighting his rugged, squared jawline, but he still moved with the loose, unhurried gait of a man who didn't belong to a corporate clock. He walked over to Leo, looking down at the NYU enrollment papers. Leo, Arthur said, his voice dropping into a deep emotional register. We struggled so hard for 8 long years. I cleaned fish so you could study under the broken street lamps. Now this money, this board, it's yours if you want it. Leo looked at the vast, sterile boardroom, then at the brass button pinned securely to his chest, and finally at his father's weathered face, the face of the man who had taken a billionaire's boot to the spine just to protect his dignity. Father, Leo said, his voice clear, strong, completely mature, and it didn't buy the way you raised me. I want to go to NYU, I want to study maritime law, but I want to earn my degree myself. I don't want a seat that someone died to give me just so I can sit in luxury. I want to build my own mountain. Arthur smiled. A brilliant, genuine smile broke across his rugged features, cutting through the old lines of exhaustion. He placed a massive, heavy hand on Leo's shoulder and turned to Evelyn. The inheritance can stay in the trust for his education, Evelyn, Arthur said softly. But tomorrow we go back to the harbor, not to haul fish crates, but to watch the ships we now legally own come in. I promised Daniel in the dark that I would raise a man, and looking at him right now, I think the promise is kept. Evelyn stood up, her eyes wet but her smile peaceful. The harbor fog over Manhattan finally broke outside the glass windows, letting a flood of golden afternoon light wash over the glass towers, the river, and the 3 generations who had finally stopped searching. They were home, Arthur smiled. A brilliant, genuine smile broke across his rugged features, cutting through the old lines of exhaustion. He placed a massive, heavy hand on Leo's shoulder and turned to Evelyn. The inheritance can stay in the trust for his education. Evelyn, Arthur said softly. But tomorrow we go back to the harbor, not to vac fish crates, but to watch the ships we now legally own come in. I promised Daniel in the dark that I would raise a man. And looking at him right now, I think the promise is kept. Evelyn stood up, her eyes wet, but her smile peaceful. The harbor fog over Manhattan finally broke outside the glass window.